What altar of refuge can a man find for himself when he commits treason against the majesty of reason? This is a quote from a great philosopher named Baruch Spinoza, and also the idea, I guess, the starting point for the name of one of the most interesting channels on YouTube that cover philosophy of religion and metaphysics and many other stuff related to philosophy in general. So I'm having the pleasure of talking today with the host of such channel, Joseph Schmid, which is a who is a philosophy PhD student at Princeton University, besides having this channel where he spends his Friday nights recording 4 3-hour long videos on theological arguments and so on. Before anything, Joe, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me, and I appreciate that intro. Yes, that's exactly how I spend my evenings on the weekends. So,
yeah. So before everything, the idea is to cover. I decided to cover with you the 5 ways by Thomas Aquinas because it's perhaps the most popular arguments or group of arguments for theists, classical theists in this debate. But also, before we go into that, I would like to tell you what I think is one of the most compelling arguments and less commented arguments for non-theism. And I'd like to hear from you what you think of that. And then you maybe can tell briefly which one you think is the most compelling argument for non-theism. Is that okay?
yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so recently I was reading a lot of the history of scripture, as in Bart Ehrman's works, such as misquoting Jesus, how Jesus became God. And since most of the debate in philosophy of religion has to do with Christian metaphysics, at least in the West, anyways, I think we can find in the history of the Bible a lot of inconsistencies, adulterations, and theological ideas that were firstly a mistake of translation, such as the virgin birth was technically a mistranslation from the book of Isaiah, and many other things like the resurrection having contradictory reports among the Gospels, and not to mention the many Gospels and letters that were cast out by Orthodox Christianity to form this Orthodox idea of that involves the Trinity, the immortality of the soul, and the pure act metaphysics. So looking from the natural point of view of history into how these texts came to become the Bible, isn't this very implausible that this is the revealed word of the creator of the universe, since he didn't even take the time to preserve the original words, which we don't have. So it looks to me as a very underlooked, I guess, a point for agnostics and atheists to address the history of the scripture, not only of Christianity but also of Judaism, because Yahweh, the God, was actually a recycled God from the early Israelite pantheon of polytheism. So he was recycled, and now he's the creator of the universe, and he has a son who is also him that incarnated 2,000 years ago and died for our sins. So when you look at it from the historical perspective, how people don't think of that, I get very perplexed. So what do you make of all that as a possible argument verbally characterized here?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing we might want to get clear on at the outset is maybe the target of the argument. So we might want to have as the target of the argument maybe Christianity specifically, or maybe Judaism and Christianity. We can at least imagine views on which there's a theistic God, but it's not how Christianity characterizes God, and it's not how Judaism characterizes God, or maybe it is, but this God didn't orchestrate the affairs of humans so as to compile the relevant books. So that's one thing that I want to get clear at the outset, that this would probably be best interpreted as an argument against Christianity specifically or Judaism specifically, and maybe not necessarily against theism as such. But that's totally fine. We can have more specific directed arguments. And so with that clarificatory note out of the way, we can then proceed to the argument itself. So my broadest point here is that, I do think some of the stuff about like the history of the composition of the Bible and preservation of certain texts, etc., I do think a lot of that at least provides some evidence against Christianity and Judaism, just because it looks all too human. Especially if you even look at the character of the Old Testament. It's like God's depicted as drowning babies in a worldwide or even local flood. Yeah. He's depicted at least as commanding the entire destruction of total people groups, including men, women, children, livestock, etc. He's depicted at least as sanctioning seemingly heinous practices, including collective punishment of later generations for what earlier generations did, etc. These all look like telltale marks of, early tribal peoples and their morality and imputing that onto God and things like that. And given that, and also given the ways that we know that the relevant books were composed and all the seeming contingencies and seeming contradictions or conflicts, it's hard to say that we don't have at least some evidence against Christianity or Judaism here, just because that all this stuff just seems more expected under the merely human hypothesis, where the merely human hypothesis is that, listen, these books are just a merely human collection. They don't have a kind of divine stamp of approval or divine guidance behind them. And then we compare that with the hypothesis that they do have, this creator of all of reality, this perfect creator of all reality behind them. And it just seems that at least these facts are less surprising on the merely human hypothesis than on the divine hypothesis. And so it's going to be at least some evidence for the merely human hypothesis. I'm actually generally sympathetic to that. What might Christians say in response? One thing they might say, they could target some of these first order claims, like, hey, you claim that there are some of these contradictions, but hey, we can resolve those. Hey, you claim these sorts of things, but hey, we can try to resolve it. So there are some Christians who try to go that route. I don't know enough of this literature to be able to talk about that, but that's just one thing they might say. A second thing they might try to say is something along the lines of, actually, maybe we can see how God would have good reason to
yeah.
God would have good reason to maybe let humans to guide humans along, given their very early intellectual and moral progress and development, to kind of guide them along through kind of progressive revelation where, at the beginning, they're kind of maybe polytheistic or maybe henotheistic, and then they kind of go to a monotheism. God guides them to that, but they're not yet ready for, Trinitarianism or whatnot. They don't have big enough brains for that yet. And so then, we wait, and I don't know, maybe there's some sort of value that can accrue out of that kind of process of learning more about God and us kind of grappling with that as well. So I don't know, maybe they can try to appeal to there being certain goods that God might be securing by bringing in the fallible humans aspect and kind of guiding them along in the ways that look merely human. I don't know. And then I guess maybe those are the main responses. I guess there maybe a third response would just be like, some Christians actually go along like, yeah, there are some contradictions here. Yeah, the Bible makes some errors. We're not inerrant. Some Christians are not inerrantists. They think that the Bible is inspired, but they take a kind of what Randall Rouser calls providential errancy approach. So God includes the errors in the Bible for a particular reason. Maybe it's to teach us some things. Maybe it's to I mean, for whatever purposes that we try to decipher by looking at the whole of the text, the narrative of the text, the revealed character of God, etc. And maybe then, I mean, that sort of view would perhaps agree with a lot of the predictions of the merely human hypothesis, because, like, the Bible is, while guided by God, I mean, it's not on this hypothesis, it's not inerrant, and God's actually using humanly error to teach us things. So anyway, I know I've said a lot, but those are some things that some Christians might say in response. But like I said at the outset, I do think we probably have at least some evidence here against Christianity, at least some.
Yeah. To all these responses, I would say that it is still seems more plausible, given the evidence, to believe that this is human to all to human stuff. Anyways, thanks for this comment, and I'd like to know before we get into Aquinas, which is the one you think is the most compelling argument for non-theism? Is that the problem of evil?
Yeah, it probably is. I mean, there's a huge collection of arguments from evil, and a variety of them, I think, have something going for them. I mean, maybe something like evolutionary animal suffering, like we know that there have been hundreds of millions of years of animals ripping each other to shreds. If that's something we'd expect like a perfect, all-loving being to do, kind of built into its very creative activity of making biological diversity in general and humans in particular, that it would kind of like orchestrate things so that like animals are ripping each other to shreds and like tearing each other apart for hundreds of millions of years, and causing each other immense suffering. Is that what we'd expect under theism? It doesn't seem like it. It seems actually extraordinarily surprising by my lights, whereas under a kind of more naturalistic view of reality, it doesn't seem nearly as surprising. So that would, I mean, that pulls on me. I think that's a pretty powerful argument. And there are different ways of running these sorts of arguments. Some are maybe more Bayesian, which is how I was just running it. Like we compare the predictions of the hypotheses. Others are, you can run them in different ways. So I would say it's at least the general class of arguments from evil. And then maybe if you want my view about which is the most plausible or maybe the most forceful version of that class of arguments, it's going to be the sort of evolutionary animal suffering, probably.
Yeah. There are some people who try to address that, like John Hick was someone who did that, and even if you claim that we are here to evolve spiritually, to overcome our incapabilities, and that's why we need evil. Why does the animals need to suffer so much for a particular class of animal to evolve themselves?
Right, and this is why, I mean, at least a lot of the maneuvers that theists typically wield in response to the problem of evil aren't available to the version that I just leveled. Like animals, like a lot oftentimes people appeal to soul building or like character growth, like, hey, it's precisely by experiencing various evils that we can build our character in various ways. We can become courageous and we can have fortitude and we can forgive other people and we can manifest these virtues, which I grant seem to be pretty valuable. But like for hundreds of millions of years, we just have animals, preying on one another, parasitizing one another, languishing, suffering, starving. It doesn't seem like they're growing their character, like it's not like the pig is like, oh yes, I'm going to grow in my character as a result of the suffering. They don't do that. So this kind of character growth or soul building doesn't seem like it's available in this case. Now, some people try to spin fancy stories on which it can be available, but those are a bit implausible. But we don't need to go into that. I mean, and like free will, it doesn't seem like the line is exercising kind of morally significant freedom and like crunching down on the neck of the gazelle. And even if it were, that doesn't seem valuable enough to justify, this atrocious suffering. So like a lot of the appeals that at least many theists make in response to at least standard formulations of the problem of evil seem unavailable when we focus on maybe this more poignant version.
Right. Do you have an indication of paper for our viewer to access this formulation specifically of the argument from evil that you could indicate?
Yeah. So Paul Draper has. I mean, I think he's probably got the best work on the problem of evil. he's got a lot of stuff on just the problem of evil in general, but also like evolutionary animal suffering.
Yeah.
I think he's got a paper from 2012 called Darwin's Argument from Evil. That's available in Yuji Nagasawa's 2012 edited book, Scientific Approaches to Philosophy of Religion by Palgrave Macmillan. That's sort of where I was kind of introduced to this. Now, Draper has other papers that are relevant. So, I mean, people just like try to find like the Paul Draper's Phil Papers profile. So, Phil Papers, PHILPAPERS.org. It's like a repository of philosophy papers. And then you can also search authors on there. And so you can search Paul Draper on there, and you can find a lot of Paul Draper's papers. But the one that I just mentioned is at least a good start.
All right, everyone, I'll put the link in the description, both for this paper and for Joe's profile as well. So
yeah, one thing about this paper, I mean, I should say, it's a chapter in a book, so it might be hard to find. I mean, I think it actually might be available, the chapter, on Google Books. I think that chapter specifically, you might be able to find it online. So anyway, you'll do your searching. If you can't find the paper itself, or the chapter itself, you can just put a link to buy the book in the description.
yeah, that sounds ethical, even though the price doesn't often sound as much, especially in different countries. Anyway, now, ladies and gentlemen, and nerds and philosophers, we are going to talk about Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, which, the 5 ways, a lot of people still think the 5 ways are some, I know there's something about this 5 ways that make them eternally popular. I don't know what it is. So, my idea was to go and read each one of them, because there's reasonably small in terms of writing, and then hear your thoughts. So each by each, what do you think of that?
That sounds like a plan.
Okay then. So I just opened here the Summa by Thomas Aquinas. So he says, as many of you know, whether God exists. And then the first, he says, the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion. Whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act, for motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which is put in motion by itself put in motion, then this also must need to be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go out to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequentially no other mover, seeing that subsequent mover moves only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So there is a lot of stuff to say here, a lot of stuff to cover. And I mean, I guess maybe I'll just start with a few preliminary notes. So like, For starters, there are lots of different ways of there are way more than 5 ways. More than 5 ways of interpreting this argument. And interpreters differ, and they formulate the argument differently. So maybe don't necessarily read me as trying to interpret Aquinas here. I'm just going to be targeting a formulation of the first way, which is inspired by what Aquinas said, but I'm not going to be claiming to interpret Aquinas, and I'm not going to say that I have the correct interpretation. I am just going to be leveling some criticisms toward an argument from motion, which is inspired by the passage that we just read. Okay, that's something that I want to say at the outset, because I'm very sensitive to the literature having a panoply of different ways of understanding this argument, and a lot of people, different people, are claiming that they have the right interpretation of Aquinas, and I do not have the interpretational or exegetical skills to be able to settle those debates. I was trained as an analytic philosopher, not as a interpretation, a hermeneutics person, person who does interpretation. Okay, so that's one thing that I want to say at the outset. Other preliminary notes for your audience, if they're curious. I have sort of published extensively criticizing arguments from motion, something like this argument from Aquinas. I've defended a wide variety of problems for it. A good place to start would be my 2023 book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. That's published with Springer, and it was co-authored with Dr. Daniel Linford. Therein we have like a really long chapter, I think it's like the second chapter, criticizing a contemporary formulation and defense of Aquinas' first way by McNabb and DeVito, among others. And we also have a whopping 6 chapters, directly or indirectly responding to what one philosopher, Edward Feser, has called the Aristotelian proof, which is an argument from change that is similar to Aquinas' first way.
Right.
So that's a preliminary note. You can put the link to that book in the description. And if people can't afford it, because it's very expensive, email me, okay? If you can't afford it, email me and I can help, okay? Just saying that. Okay. So a second preliminary, actually this is a third preliminary. I've also made lots of popular content on this argument on YouTube. So I have an argument from Change playlist, and I think it's got probably at least a dozen videos in there, wherein I criticize arguments from Change.
Other YouTuber has an argument from Change playlist. All right, this is something rather unique that we must acknowledge.
Right, exactly. Okay, so now on to an argument inspired by what Aquinas wrote.
Yeah.
So one claim that we have here, and it's kind of the start, is that motion or change exists. Yeah, that seems right. And then we get an account of what change is. We get Aquinas is giving us an account of what change is. He's trying to spell out the essence or nature of change. He's trying to give a kind of account or definition of change. And he says change is essentially when a potency is reduced to actuality, or in other words, when a potential becomes actual, or something in a state of potential being transitions to a state of actual being. Now, and this account is central to the argument and the subsequent, sort of the entire metaphysics, the metaphysical edifice upon which Aquinas' thought rests. And while I grant the existence or reality of change, I do not grant this account of motion for a variety of reasons. I think there are various problems afflicting it. One problem, and there may be certain very technical and sophisticated ways to try to get around this problem, but I at least want to make the audience aware of it as a potential problem, is what we call the circularity problem. And more generally, let's take a step back. Whenever we're trying to give an account of something, like an account of something's essence, like what it is, like humanity, like what is it to be human? We don't want to, in giving an account of that thing, sort of presuppose the very thing we're giving an accounting of. We don't want to give an account of something in terms of that very thing, or in terms that are sort of synonymous with the thing that we're trying to give an account of, like linguistically synonymous. Otherwise, we're sort of just presupposing the very, we're not giving an illuminating account. We've just kind of taken it for granted. This often comes up in very heated debates about, what is a woman, and generally all parties, I shouldn't say all parties, most parties to the dispute even trans-inclusive philosophers don't want to analyze or give an account of what a woman is in terms of something like, hey, what it is to be a woman is to identify as a woman. Why is that? Well, because we just used woman in giving an account of what a woman is. It's kind of like circular. So that's let's then take a closer look then at this analysis of change, or this account of change. Well, the account is something like change. What change is a potential becoming actual, or a potential coming to be actualized, or something passing from potential being to actual being, or sort of transition from potential to actual. But it seems to me that these accounts are circular accounts or definitions of change. It seems to me that they're just equivalent to analyzing change in terms of some state of potential being transitioning to or changing to a state of actuality. And that's, of course, just to analyze change in terms of change itself, or at least like semantic cognates thereof. And that, if you show an analysis or an account to be circular in some way, that's generally taken to be a very serious problem with that account. So that's one way that at least some philosophers have criticized this account of change. Again, I'm not saying that this is like some sort of insuperable problem and that all Thomists have been stunned into silence upon facing this problem, but it's something that defenders of the argument very much need to be aware of. And there's sort of active debate as to whether or not this can be solved. So that's one problem for just this account of change. And there are other problems too. I mean, I'll just maybe be briefer with these other ones.
You don't need to get as technical as you do, because in your channel you have 40 minutes videos for each of the ways. So we don't have this time here. It's all right if you summarize a little bit.
Okay, sweet. Then I'll go a little bit quicker. I also tend to think that this account of change is not adequately justified. I don't see a particularly good reason to analyze change in this sort of way, as opposed to analyzing change in some other way, or just leaving change as a primitive, unanalyzable feature of reality. So I don't think there's adequate justification here. And at least in my view, I also think the account is just implausible because it's committed to a view called ontological pluralism, which is just the view that there are different like ways or modes of being or existence. Yeah. And there's active debate as to whether or not that's even intelligible in philosophy. But even if it were intelligible, there are very serious problems with it. So, for instance, Trent Merrick's paper, The Only Way to Be, published in Noose, I think in 2019, poses a very serious challenge to this sort of view. And the way that this account presupposes this ways of being kind of pluralism is that, it's talking about potential being and actual being as these different sort of ways or kinds of existence that something can be in. So that's another problem for the account of change. I think there are other arguably better accounts. And I guess finally, arguably, this account assumes the falsity of a pretty popular view in philosophy of time called eternalism, on which all of time is equally real or equally actual. All times exist. They're equally on a par. People argue that special and general relativity very strongly motivate this sort of view. There are various philosophical arguments for this sort of view. And regardless of whether or not it's true, it's generally taken to be a drawback of an account if it requires us to presuppose the falsity of an independently motivated view elsewhere in philosophy. You're kind of just piling on the metaphysical baggage that you have to take on to accept this account of change. And you're thereby also getting many more arguments against your view in virtue of the arguments for the view that the view that's incompatible with your view, right? So eternalism. And again, and the reason why those are arguably incompatible is because, hey, at least according to eternalism, all times are equally actual. But there's still change, like things vary over the temporal dimension. Things are first one way and then they're another way. But both the terminus of the change and the beginning of the change, as it were, are equally actual under eternalism. So change really isn't the transition from something which is like merely potential to a state of actuality. Okay, there are various things that can be said with respect to these problems and whatnot, but I don't even buy the account of change here on which this argument rests. And then, the next sort of premise is that given that there's change and it's analyzed in this way, hey, any potential when it becomes actual has to be caused by something in a state of actuality. I'm inclined to think that so let's grant this underlying metaphysics. I'm inclined to think that whenever a potential becomes actual, there needs to be an explanation of why the potential becomes actual. But it's not at all clear to me why that explanation needs to be a causal explanation specifically. There are all different sorts of explanations, ranging from explanations in terms of structural constraints, explanations like in terms of non-causal grounding. So that's like one thing obtaining or occurring in virtue of something more fundamental, but it's not kind of causal notion. It's not really a causal production. It's more like a kind of constitutive relation. and so on. There are lots of different non-causal styles of explanation, and it's not clear to me why we need to be sent off in a kind of causal regress here, and why we can't explain potentials becoming actual non-causally. Okay, then we get the anti-infinite regress premise. Now, technically speaking, this is restricted to a particular kind of regress, namely a kind of essentially ordered regress, where the members later in the chain sort of derive the relevant changing ability from all of the earlier members. So it's like the later members, their activity kind of presupposes the activity of all the earlier members, and they kind of wholly derive their activity from all the preceding members. So they don't sort of have the activity in and of themselves. They kind of have to derive it from without. Now, do chains like that have to be finite? Can they regress infinitely? It's a really good question.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely...
Not.
Go on.
It doesn't seem clear why not.
Right, and I mean, the reason at least that we get in the Aquinas passage is like, well, hey, if there weren't a first, then there wouldn't be subsequent ones, since they derive their ability from the first. But like a lot of people, and even Thomas included, have argued that that's a kind of seemingly question-begging argument. I mean, like, the very question at issue is whether or not things which derive their ability from without have to have a first member without which they wouldn't be deriving their ability. Like, that's the very thing you need to be establishing in Aquinas. You can't just help yourself to that as a premise. So, I mean, there's some intuitive plausibility here. I mean, like, some people give an IOU example. So, like an IOU is basically like, I owe you money, and it's a little certificate or something like that. And like, suppose that, you give me an IOU that says, I promise to pay you $1,000, but like you borrowed that IOU from someone else, and that person borrowed an IOU from someone else, and so on. If that proceeds to infinity, it seems like I'm never going to get my money. I don't really even have the money in this case. And that's because I only have the money purely derivatively, and there's like no ultimate source which has it non-derivatively. So maybe there's some plausibility to this denial of infinite regresses, but it's controversial. And I mean, if people want to look at some recent work on this, Thomas Oberle, I think he's getting his PhD. He might have recently gotten his PhD. Has some really good papers examining these kinds of Thomistic regress arguments here. So he's got a paper in International Journal for Philosophy of Religion entitled "Grounding Infinite Regress in the Thomistic Cosmological Argument." He's also got a Phil Quarterly article called "No Work for Fundamental Facts," a Phil Studies article, "Metaphysical Explanation in the Cosmological Argument," and then a dialogue article entitled "Metaphysical Foundationalism and the Principle of Sufficient Reason," where he really kind of criticizes this sort of reasoning. So anyway, people can check that out if they want to sort of make up their own mind on this.
All right. So I think we covered a branch of problems here in the first way. I think we can move on. I will try to
very briefly, if I could just, I'll give it like 2 more minutes. Right. And we can extend the video by 2 minutes. That's fine as well. So that's the infinite regress premise. And then if we combine all those premises, we get that there's at least one thing which is unmoved, maybe at least in a particular respect of the causal power of the series for which it stands as terminus, and which does not sort of derive that activity from without. And this is very far from getting to something which is unchangeable in all respects. So, like, this is another criticism that people level, like, all it gets you to is something which is in fact unmoved, and perhaps only in fact unmoved in respect of the causal power or a feature of the chain in question, like the power to heat or whatever. That is a very far cry from something which is unchangeable in that respect, and also unchangeable in all respects. And then that, in turn, even if we granted that the thing is unchangeable in all respects, that's a very far cry from God. Now, of course, later in the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas tries to derive the various divine attributes. I don't think his derivations succeed. I have a chapter in my book on Mind the Gap, wherein I look at least some contemporary kind of renditions of Aquinas' own arguments, and we argue that they systematically fail. So I think there are lots of issues here.
All right. Yeah. I think it was Dr. Graham Hoppe, but he was commenting the second way, I think, or the third way, where he says that there could, he doesn't specify where there could not be multiple first causes.
Yeah, exactly.
and even circular causes.
Right. Yeah. We would,
Yeah.
technically speaking, you're right. We need to add another premise that there can't be circular chains of causation. Right.
I don't know if didn't he it cross his mind. It's hard to tell, right? Because it's so short and it's not analytically structured. As it's just
Right, and to be right, and for the audience, I mean, to be fair, it's called a summa theologiae for a reason. This is really just a summary
yeah,
intended for some of his like intro friars. It's just like, hey, this is a summary. Aristotle and others have written on these things elsewhere, etc. So he's really just trying to be brief. So you
yeah.
know, no fault to Aquinas for that.
Right. So I'll go through the reading of the second and third way very fast, and maybe you can comment on them together because these three first ways are rather similar in some
Right.
respects. Okay, so the second way is from the nature of the efficient cause. In the world of sense, we find there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be efficient cause of itself. For so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Now, in efficient causes, it's not possible to go on to infinity, because in all efficient causes following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Therefore, if there be no first cause among the efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediate cause. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause to which everyone gives the name of God. The third way, now, is taken from possibility and necessity and run thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be. Since kind of Shakespeare, right? Aquinas is Shakespeare before Shakespeare. Since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are possible to be and not to be. But it is impossible for this always to exist. For that which is possible not to be at the same at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must be something the existence of which is necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Now it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as have been already proved in regard to efficient causes. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. These all men speak of as God. Okay.
Right. So, as with the first way and all subsequent ways, I'll just make this very quick preliminary note that there are interpretive debates among relevant experts as to how to interpret these arguments. So I will be responding to an argument inspired by what Aquinas says. I'm not actually, you know, saying that I'm responding to the second way as Aquinas interprets it. Okay. I'm not into that. I'm just going to look at an interpretation of Aquinas, an argument gleaned from what he says, and respond to that. Okay. So then, the second way, we see things that are, you know, caused efficiently, and we then try to trace those effects via a causal regress to a first uncaused cause, because there can't be infinite causal regresses, and by the way, there also can't be circular causal chains. Okay, so that's roughly the argument. Now, a lot of people think that Aquinas is here talking about specifically sustaining causation, so like a cause which keeps the relevant effect in existence at any moment at which the effect exists. So something that kind of concurrently sustains it in existence or conserves it in existence. A lot of people think that that's the kind of efficient cause that Aquinas is talking about. And if so, then this argument is going to face the challenge posed by the existential inertia thesis, which is a thesis that is developed and extensively defended in this book right here. We respond to almost all extant objections to existential inertia in the literature. And that thesis basically just says, like, hey, well, let's take a step back. What is spatial inertia or Newtonian inertia? Well, things continue in their rectilinear motion unless and until they're acted upon by some net force, at which point they'll either stop moving or they'll change direction or accelerate in some way. Okay, and existential inertia is just like that. But instead of talking about motion, we're just talking about existence. So things continue to exist. Oh, and by the way, in that Newtonian inertia, things don't need a kind of continual impetus, as arguably Aristotle thought. You know, things like in order to move through space, they need some sort of continual impetus that kind of pushes them along. For Newtonian inertia, that's not the case. And likewise, existential inertia says that things continue to exist without the need for some kind of sustaining or conserving cause, and they cease to exist precisely when they're kind of knocked out of existence. They're caused to cease to exist, either by factors internal to them or external to them. So then, you can kind of see then that, you know, like Aquinas is saying that, like, the things of our experience, like finite, limited things maybe in which essence and existence are distinct, or contingent things, or whatever, need some kind of sustaining cause for their existence, and we can't trace sustaining causes ad infinitum, so we have to get to some first uncaused sustaining cause. I would then push back on that claim that the things of our experience need sustaining causes. So that's one way I'd push back. We do also get the worries of how are we motivating the denial of infinite regresses here, and we talked about that. I'll just defer to our discussion on the first way with respect to that. And then, of course, also this conclusion that there's an uncaused first cause. I don't think that this argument is going to get you that it's uncaused in all respects whatsoever, only that it's uncaused in respect of its existence. It may very well still be able to be caused in accidental respects. Just like how that problem afflicted the first way, we don't get that it's unchangeable in all respects. And also, even if we could get that it's uncaused in all respects, we are still faced with the problem that, you know, it seems like we can't infer uniqueness or really lots of other divine attributes. Again, Aquinas tries to do that later on in the Summa. But again, I have responded to lots of those arguments in my published work and on my channel. And so I really do think there's still that kind of gap problem, that problem of how are we really getting to God here, rather than just some like impersonal, uncaused, ultimate reality. That's a very serious challenge. So that's the second way, and then or at least an interpretation of the second way, and then onto the third way. At least one major problem here is that, I mean, he talks about things that are contingent, things that can exist, but also can fail to exist. We call those things contingent things. And, I mean, one of his premises is that contingent things, at some point, contingent things sort of can't always exist. Instead, they, at some time, they don't exist. And, I mean, at least depending on, see, again, there are interpretive difficulties here, and it's hard to elide those interpretive difficulties. But, like, at least on its face, we might think that something could be possible to be and not to be. But yet, nevertheless, if it exists at all, it's going to have to exist sort of permanently. It's not like it has to fail to exist at some time or other, which is what Aquinas seems to be asserting, that whatever is possible to be or not to be must be such that at least at some time it is not. And we might reject that. And I mean, I myself don't think that there's particularly good reason to accept that. But again, there are sort of interpretive difficulties here, maybe depending on what Aquinas means specifically by possible, that can be more plausible. But anyway, so that's one problem with that. Another problem is that when Aquinas says that, I mean, listen, if each thing were such that there were some time at which it didn't exist, well, then there'd be some time at which nothing exists. But that, and a lot of commentators have argued this, I mean, even the Thomist, at least people who are Thomist sympathizers, in this book, the entry on, so this book is called Just the Arguments, 100 of the Most Important Arguments in Western Philosophy. There's a section in here by Catholic philosopher Timothy Paul.
It's from Michael Bruce and Stephen Barbone. Is that one?
Yeah, those are the editors. Yeah, and so this is really an edited collection. And in here,
I have it.
Nice.
This is the.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah,
that's so cool. Yeah, so Timothy Paul he did the one on Aquinas' 5 ways in there, and overall it's a good article. I mean, it's very, very short. They wanted to make this super short for all the arguments, but like even he points out in here, and he's a Catholic philosopher, at least a Thomist sympathizer. I don't know if he described himself as a Thomist. And he points out that like there really does seem to be a sort of quantifier fallacy at this point. Just because each thing is such that there's some time at which it doesn't exist, it doesn't follow that there's some time at which everything doesn't exist. You know, just because each thing, just because each person has a mother, it doesn't follow that there's some one mother for everything, for, you know, like mother humanity. Or like take the classroom, just because each student in the class has a pencil, it doesn't follow that there's some like one pencil that all the students have or share. Or like just because each day of the week is such that it's possible that I was born on that day of the week, it doesn't follow that it's possible that I was born on all the days of the week. So like there's a sort of illicit quantifier shift arguably going on here, so that Aquinas kind of makes an invalid inference here. And then of course, you know, we also get Aquinas relying on this no infinite regresses of a certain kind, and we raised at least potential questions about that earlier. And then finally we get to something which is necessary through itself, and we're supposed to infer that that's God, but there is the kind of looming gap problem here. How are we bridging the gap from something which is necessary through itself to God specifically? Again, I have to say this because, you know, people get their feathers riled up. Again, Aquinas goes on in the Summa to dedicate many, many questions to trying to tease out from these various conclusions divine attributes. And again, I don't think that the arguments therein succeed. So yeah, that's the main stuff to be said with respect to this argument.
Yeah. There is a presupposition here that, at least in the way I interpret the argument, that this first cause, this pure act, have to be identical to God. And why can't it be something else? Like, why the reality itself, the universe, speaking ontologically, couldn't be self-existing? Why would that have to be the natural universe and something else, right? Because in the naturalist frame, it seems easier to account for reality, because you don't have to have this other thing. It's just one thing. It sounds simpler.
Yeah, I mean, there is that sort of simplicity argument. So this is at least in Graham Oppie, you know, he's also a foremost critic of a lot of these sorts of arguments. This is one of his. So he has this book that you can also put in the description, "The Best Argument Against God." Now, of course, it's a little bit of a flashy title, but you know, he thinks it's like something that moves him. He doesn't claim that it has to rationally compel everyone. He thinks that theists can be rational, that atheists can be rational, that agnostics can be rational. I think we should all agree with that. But the way that he sort of argues for atheism is that, and specifically naturalism, is that it seems like we can explain, so Graham Oppie argues, it seems like we can explain things just as well as the theist, but yet we have a simpler kind of ontology. We don't posit God in addition to the natural world. And all else being equal, you know, when you have a simpler hypothesis which explains relevant data, at least as well as the relevant competing hypothesis, you should side with the simpler hypothesis. And that's his general argument for atheism. I think that's what you're gesturing towards, and it's definitely something that's, relevant here.
Okay. So moving on to the fourth way. The fourth way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like. But more and less are predicated of different things, according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter according as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest. So that there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequentially something which is uttermost being. For those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being, as it is written in Metaphysics, Book 2. Now the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. I just start off saying that I don't see why there must be a maximum, a summum bonum, or something like that for everything. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, at least in Timothy Paul. So again, different formulations. Just at least going off Timothy Paul's formulation. I mean, I've got the book right in front of me. I mean, he formulates the argument in such a way that it relies on a premise according to which, if something is more or less F, this is P2 on page 16 of the book, my book. If something is more or less F, where F is some predicate, then there is something maximally F. And as you're saying, like we might just really harbor worries about this. Like if something is more or less numerous, then there's something which is maximally numerous. That doesn't seem plausible. And in fact, seems like for any collection which is numerous, there can be a more numerous collection, so there can't be a maximally numerous collection. And so on. Like, for any diameter, for any length of diameter, it seems like there could be a longer diameter for any, for something which is more or less sided. So like consider sidedness of shapes. I don't think it makes sense to say that there's like a maximally sided shape.
Great example. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. And I mean, I think what a lot of Aquinas scholars try to get at this juncture is like to say that there's something distinctive about these what they call transcendentals, right, of like being, truth, goodness, beauty, which is like distinctive to that and not to these counterexamples, where the principle does apply. Trust me, bro. The principle does apply to the transcendentals. But I guess I don't see it, and I haven't come across like a sufficient motivation for that, especially given that we know that there are counterexamples in other domains. Why couldn't there also be a counterexample in this case? Yeah, so I that's probably the place where I'd target it, target the argument, and I'm also questioning, like, at least in Timothy Paul's formulation, it relies on a premise according to which if something is maximally F, then it's the cause of all things that are F. So like the maximal in the relevant, I don't want to say category, because like these are supposed to transcend the categories, but the maximal with respect to F, or at least the maximal with respect to the transcendental, they're supposed to be like the causes of the things that are less than maximal. It's like, why should I accept that? Why are other things good or true in like because of this other thing that they stand in relation to? Like I thought that
we got counterexamples to that. We got counterexamples even in the theory of evolution.
Yeah, I mean, so I was going to think of like potential counterexample. Like, we might think that like, hey, the things of our experience are good in virtue of like their intrinsic characters, not in virtue of some sort of extrinsic relation to this like maximal thing. It's just like part of the very nature of like part of the very phenomenology of pleasure accounts for why it's good. Like that's what explains why it's good, and not some sort of relation to some extrinsic thing. So there are ways to challenge that sort of premise as well. There are also questions as to how we are identifying all these maximal things. So like apparently we get to like a maximal thing that's maximally true, like maximally good, like maximally beautiful, and so on. And there's a question of like, well, I think that these are all one and the same thing. Like could there be a maximal one that's here maximal in that respect, a different one that's maximal in this respect, and so on. Now again, there are ways to try to solve these problems, but like there are ways also to respond to ways of those solving problems. And I'm just trying to give the audience of a glimpse into how philosophers have criticized these sorts of things, and what I find critical. And then finally, there's the question of whether or not something which is maximal in all these respects would be God. And maybe that's so. I mean, if it's maximal, I don't understand what it means to be maximally true. But if it's maximally good and it's maximally noble, again, there's a question of what nobility means, but maybe it means like perfection or something like that. It's like maybe a maximally perfect, maximally good reality. I think, yeah, that's much more plausibly God. But yeah, anyway, that's the fourth way.
Okay, good. Now, at last but not least, the fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way so as to obtain the best result. Hence, it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly do they achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end. And this being we call God. Okay.
All right. Yeah. So let's turn to Timothy Paul's formulation. So Timothy, it's very brief. That's why I didn't turn to the other ones, because some of them have got like 9 premises and like 9 sub-conclusions. This one has 3 premises, okay? The first premise is, if something always, or for the most part, acts in the same way in order to bring about that which is best, then it acts for the sake of an end. The second premise is that beings in nature always, or for the most part, act in the same way in order to bring about that which is best. We might sort of question this here. I mean, this seems to be relying on some kind of like teleological realism, where there are like real ends out there built into reality, like real kind of end goals that things have. And at least, in the wake of modern philosophy, from Galileo roughly on, maybe Bacon onwards, this has strongly fallen out of favor, and we tend to think of nature as just a system of like efficient and material causes, and perhaps operating according to laws, but at least there isn't much room in that sort of picture of the world for these end goals to do kind of any explanatory heavy lifting. And so it's sort of fallen out of favor among a lot of philosophers. Now, it actually turns out to be at least much more difficult to get away from that sort of teleology in the biological realm. Biologists do find themselves almost always talking in terms of function and the goal, like the function of the heart is to pump blood, and like there could be malfunctions and things like that. So it's harder to avoid real objective teleology in the case of biological organisms. So maybe Aquinas would want to run his argument just restricted to that as a response to what I'm saying. But like, anyway, this is one way that philosophers respond to this argument, by saying, hey, this presupposes that there's real objective teleology in nature, even beyond the biological realm and beyond the mental realm. And that's very contentious, and rejected by at least most contemporary philosophers. Then we have that if beings in nature act for the sake of an end, if they do really have this kind of objective teleological directedness to them, then they must be directed by something that has, like intelligence. There must be some sort of intelligence that directs them. And I don't see why I should accept that. Like, suppose I go along with the kind of objective teleology. I'm just gonna, say something to the effect of, it's just like things have the natures that they do, or things have the ends that they do in virtue of the natures that they have. Like an electron has the end of, again, if we must speak this way, as the argument requires, an electron has the end of repelling other electrons and attracting to protons, just in virtue of what an electron is. Like that's just part of its nature, or something like that. That's what accounts for it's having the relevant end. We don't need to feel some kind of extrinsic intelligence outside of the natural world kind of directing things. Things are kind of directed by their own steam, as it were, by their own natures. It's their natures which explain why they have the relevant teleological directness, and which confer on them the relevant powers, which reliably manifest in the relevant ways to kind of bring about those ends. So I'm not sure why we need to go beyond just appealing to the natures of things in this. And that's not at all clear to me. And even if we did have to appeal to some kind of intelligence behind things being directed, again, all we're able to infer is that for each thing which is directed, there is an intelligence which directs it. It doesn't follow that there's some one intelligence which directs all of the natural world. And it certainly doesn't follow that it would be like unlimited, or that, it'd really be anything other than a demiurge. Or really anything deserving of the appellation God. It might be morally indifferent. Maybe that's what explains why we have beings with the teleological end of inflicting suffering on other beings, like the ginormous, like fangs, and like the organisms. Some organisms just seem to be almost designed in such a way that they are like designed to inflict like maximal suffering on other organisms. So like maybe we should go along with this argument and infer that there's like an indifferent designer behind the whole thing. But anyway, now again, Thomas have not been silent about why we can try to infer God specifically from this argument. But again, I don't think those arguments are particularly compelling. And so those are the main worries that I and many other philosophers harbor for the fifth way.
Yeah. So, all right. It seems our timing was actually quite good here. We managed to cover the five ways, the great five ways, and
Yeah, and if you, I mean, we could cover some other, I got like five-ish, 10-ish minutes. So if you want to cover something else, I'm fine with that. Or
all right, all right.
we don't have to. I mean,
No, I'm gonna now that you just said that, I'm going to uh, suggest that he says here, as Augustine says in reply to objection one, whatever that is. Since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works, unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist, and out of it produce good. Doesn't help her very much, right?
right. So like again, to be fully fair to Aquinas, this is just a summary of theology. So he's just like very briefly saying, like, listen, when you're faced with the problem of evil, try to say something along the lines of, like God allows evil because greater goods can come as a result of evil or something like that. So like, we can't sort of fault him for not addressing the panoply of dimensions of the problem of evil. But yeah, I mean, it's not a terribly compelling response to the problem of evil. For a variety of reasons. I mean, for starters, it's not just that some good needs to come about as a result of the relevant evil. It seems like the good needs to be like worth it. Like it needs to be sufficiently outweighing of the relevant evil. And so like we can ask as for any purported good that the theist is identifying, like free will or soul building, we should be asking ourselves, like, okay, I grant that this is a good that may come out of various evils, but like, is it really worth it? Is it really worth those evils? Does it really outweigh the relevant evils? And at least I submit, for at least many cases, many instances of evil, and perhaps many even classes of evil, that's not the case. And many of our judgments even indicate that. Like, we lock people up, right? When they murder people, etc. We don't like let them continuing murdering people because, like, they got free will, like that's so valuable that they're exercising their free will. It's like, no, like, sure, that's valuable, okay, but like, the lives of the people being murdered is like kind of more valuable. So like, we lock the person up and we curb their freedom, we restrict their freedom, and we take that to be like a good thing, the right thing to do. And so, like, sure, like if we didn't lock the murderers up, a good would be produced, I guess. Like someone is exercising their morally significant freedom. But like, it clearly doesn't justify us in allowing murderers to run rampant on the streets. And that's because the relevant good being produced does not outweigh the relevant evil, and maybe for some other reasons as well. But that's one reason. So like, one thing that we need to keep in mind here is that like the relevant good has to outweigh the relevant evil. It also seems plausible that the relevant evils should be like necessary for the production of the good. So like, suppose God could have achieved the relevant goods without the evils. Well, then it seems like God shouldn't then allow the relevant evil, like produce the goods by going through the circuitous route of the evils, if he could have just secured the relevant goods without going through that route, without that horrific suffering. So like, we do this with you're going to your doctor or something, and your doctor like says, I'm gonna put you through this horrific surgery, and it's gonna be like a month of just laying in bed in agony. But at the end of it, you'll come out as good as new. Okay, so you go through this whole process, and after the month, you've been reading online that like, oh my gosh, there's a pill that I could have taken which would have gotten me this result.
Yeah.
Without going through that month of horrific suffering, and they have it at the doctor's office. So you call up your doctor, and your doctor's like, "Yeah, I know, but like, I produced good." You're like, "Look, you're better now." You would be irate. You would be rightly irate because your doctor, although he produced even a greater good, we can suppose, which outweighs the relevant evil, that evil was not needed to bring about that good. That good could have been produced. The good of you being good as new without going through that month of horrific suffering just by taking the pill. So like, it seems like you have the right to complain to your doctor. I think the doctor did something wrong. This is not a perfect doctor. And so this indicates that it also seems to be the case that the relevant evils need to be necessary for the relevant greater goods that are being produced. And again, this is where the problem of evil will get its force. Like, does it really seem plausible that like hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering is necessary for certain outweighing goods.
Yeah.
Doesn't it seem plausible that God could have just like created things as the young Earth creationists think, and still have gotten the goods of biological diversity and the goods of humans and etc. So, and there's lots more to say here, but you can see why this would not be a particularly satisfying response just in itself.
Yeah, it sums it all up. It's a good analogy. Uh, we certainly would not choose perfect to characterize this doctor, or
No.
nonetheless maximally good, or something like that. Very questionable. Even the agnostic God is more plausible in this case. But anyway, the demiurge. But anyways,
Right.
this is this was a great pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. So if you wish to promote anything that you are putting out there now, or any website or book, the space is yours.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed the chat, and these are really fun topics, and I hope people can explore these things further. And to do that, they can check out the various references that I gave throughout this video, and also my YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason. You should immediately go to it, click subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications, like every single one of my videos, become a patron. I'm messing around. Maybe not. That's a moral obligation. Okay, so then that's my YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason. Check that out. And then I guess the only other things that would be relevant are, I mean, I've got a blog that I write responses to people on. Not very active on it, but like I write responses to people who respond to my work. So that's majestyofreason.wordpress.com. And then my website, where people can find all my work, my papers, etc. All my papers are on there for free. I can't upload books for free online. But again, people email me if you can't afford my books. So that website is josephschmid.com. Schmid, SCHMID. So yeah, check all that out, and I hope to serve people going forward in their pursuit of truth.
Yeah, it's going to be in the description, guys. So this is it for today. Everybody, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. And also subscribe if you're not subscribed.